Well, thank you, and thank you for taking the time to uh, f- teach us really about unions and a better life for employees.
No, thank you so much for being willing to do this and help get the word out and hopefully convince some businesses to be a little less stubborn on the topic.
I wanted to look up some of my own information on unions and the work of organizing unions and the issues that get involved. And one note I had, there was a list of 36 questions that come up with how you treat your employees. You know, is there a paid vacation? Is there sick leave? Social Security? What about overtime pay? Child labor laws? So you're dealing with all kinds of things, but it would be interesting to find out what if you were told by Starbucks there's that there's they want to know what the five things are that they could change about the way they manage their employees. What are the five things you would say need improvement?
Well, I think it all boils down to one thing, which
One
is
thing.
workers really having a voice and a democratic organization to represent their own interests. I think companies, when they learn that workers are interested in unionizing, always want to find out, why us? What did we do? What can we do differently? And there's a whole union busting industry that's dedicated to, trying to keep unions out by advising companies on what they can do.
It's a nice story to expose that they won't even let any union thought come into their strategy building. And because the atmosphere is such that you can't make much progress. The main effort is to save what the progress that you've already made.
Well,
But
I would push back on that slightly.
okay, go ahead.
I think that, a lot of folks within the labor movement do think that their main role is to, protect what they already have, including, spending more time sometimes on defending, pension plans and, things that workers have won in the past. And a lot of that is why we have such low union density. But I've organized, under Obama labor rules, under Trump first administration labor rules, under Biden labor rules, and now back to Trump labor rules. And the real um, impact of the law isn't as massive as people think. Obviously, it's better to have a labor board that isn't trying to strip the right to organize away from workers, but the actual teeth of the law are really not there. The law has no penalties for companies that break the law. And the real way to get a company to the bargaining table and to agree to a first contract and to stop retaliating against workers for organizing is through public pressure and other forms of pressure that aren't the law. So I think in my current work, I'm working on a project called the Inside Organizer School that recruits and trains young people on how to organize their own workplaces or how to get jobs and organize them. And I'm working on campaigns in Los Angeles. And so many people are coming to us being like, with everything going on right now, I think this is the most important thing I can be doing. And some unions, including RWDSU at Barnes and Noble, have been winning campaigns under the new Trump regime, not by relying on the law, but by relying on, the company's own image and impacting their customer relationships, et cetera. So I think there is a need to continue our organizing even in this climate, but I also think people are kind of being like, okay, nothing else is going to save us. The law's not going to save us. The government's not going to save us. Businesses are not going to save us. They're all lining up behind Trump for the most part. And so building power outside of those institutions is something that the labor movement can uniquely do.
So there are two fronts to work on. One is how you hand how the union handles their relations to the owners of Starbucks or any other company, and then how the unions handle their media relations. Because it would help in the second case if some media, and I'm thinking of the New York Times and Washington Post and so on, uh, get more coverage of what's going on and and writing up nice stories about the fact that the union movement is there to improve the company's performance and profits, really. That and use the logic that in any conflict, there's two resolutions. One is where there's a win-win for both sides. The other is where there's a win for one side and a loss to the other side. In the second case, that loss to one side is going to fester and make both sides lose. Win-lose is a solution of lose-lose. And so we got to get, not only through media, but through company discussions, the value that can be generated by good, happy employees. And of course, that's normal. It's like you asking Starbucks, are they, would it be better for them to have unhappy employees or happier employees? Um, and maybe there's cases where you could demonstrate how poor the service is when the employees feel unserved by the management. How and that poor service. Now, maybe the fact is everyone will by habit go and get a coffee, and the company knows that they are mad at the unions for making problems for them, which they don't think they actually Starbucks believes that if they pay adequately and if they make them the workers into partners by we always said, by the way, that a company would be smart to make the payment that the workers get more than simply the wage they get. They should have more benefits and they should also be participating profitable in the profit made by the Starbucks. And that's normal now. I think Starbucks will agree that they would more like more of their workers to be owning shares in Starbucks.
Well, I think actually I'd like to point out a anti-Starbucks example, which is I helped workers organize at the scoop shop for Ben and Jerry's in Burlington, Vermont. And, you shouldn't have to be organizing at Ben and Jerry's for the company to do the right thing. Other companies should follow that lead. But Ben and Jerry's wasn't always pro-union. They've union busted in the past, in the 90s and early 2000s. And so part of them, doing the right thing this time was that we had unanimous support of every worker who worked at the scoop shop. And so, oftentimes companies are like, oh, these unions are outside agitators. They're leafleting the plant gates. They're clearly stirring up our workers who would otherwise be happy. And, that trope goes back to, before the Civil War. It goes to the Civil Rights Movement, and it goes to just about every union campaign in U.S. history, including, Starbucks would accuse us. I was a SALT, meaning somebody who got a job with the goal of organizing. But they accused so many Starbucks workers of being SALTs who were not, and who had been there for many years and just wanted more of a say. But at Ben and Jerry's, we had unanimous support, and then the company had seen the bad publicity that Starbucks was getting. And so there was a headline early on after they had recognized the union, but before we had reached a first contract that was like, be a Ben and Jerry's, not a Starbucks. And management came into bargaining, like fist bumping everybody. They were so excited to get that kind of publicity. And so, obviously for a Ben and Jerry's, where your brand is really tied in with keeping, your progressive customer base convinced that you're upholding your values, that's an easier decision to make, although not one that they had always made in the past. But I think, we are trying to convince more companies that that is a better path. I think one of the ways that you convince them that's a better path is with customer pressure, whether that's authors telling Barnes and Nobles that they didn't want to do events at a company that, was union busting where workers might be going on strike over the company's unfair labor practices, whether it's Starbucks, that's people, boycotting the company and saying we don't want to go here until you actually respect the right to organize and stop retaliating against the union, especially, after we took our stance in solidarity with Palestine. Starbucks went nuts and started suing the union and attacking workers. So I think the actual mechanism of the pressure campaign can take different forms, but
Mm.
that's
Yeah.
what's really going to win the right to organize.
Yeah. Um, what what about the entrance entrances? Well, the fact that Howard Schultz, who was in my mind before any of this came up with Starbucks unions, a hero who cared about. He was a progressive, and I would have predicted that he would have been smart about accepting some unionization, but I'm so disappointed in him, and maybe many progressives are, and hope that he could change his mind. And I bet it's your feeling that he will never change his mind. He's just hardened into the crowd. His crowd are investors, and he will die before he'll let any union get away with a voice in Starbucks. Is that the case? So working
Well,
on him, working on shaming him. First of all, it would be better not to shame. It would be better to make him one of the nice progressive people. But uh, he's hopeless in this case. Is that correct?
Well, I think certainly the progress that has been made so far happened once he was not in the CEO role and Lakshman came in as CEO. And, now he's out and the former Chipotle CEO is in, who has a much more typically, US style union busting by any means necessary approach. And so that's a bad sign. I think under Lakshman, as CEO, there was some progress toward, stopping fighting the union. Regarding Howard, I think we were all hopeful in the beginning that he would make good on what he always says about being a different kind of company. I think he's, very carefully crafted this image of himself. And I think part of his opposition to unions is, he's written in one of his previous books that he thinks any union effort is a referendum on him as a leader. And so it's super personal. He doesn't understand that a union could be just as
Mhm.
necessary at a company with good leadership as bad leadership. And, I mean, the union campaign brought out the very worst in Howard, where he flew to Buffalo at the very last for the last meeting of the campaign and told us about, how great he was and how great Starbucks was for giving workers all these benefits, and then compared him and Starbucks giving us these benefits to the Holocaust and to prisoners in Auschwitz sharing their blankets with each other, which was really inappropriate and also helped a lot of people be like, wait a second, if that guy doesn't want me to unionize, I'm gonna go sign a union card right now. So it didn't work the way Howard was planning. But I think, yeah, it's deeply personal for him, but also like I think the standard of what counts as a progressive boss has changed, and it's harder to be considered progressive and be union busting. So obviously, there's been a huge shift in what the role of unions is in the US, where, at one point in the post-war era, the law was devised to be more of a process for workers to decide to unionize. And, the company wasn't supposed to be a participant in that process. And so, the mass unionization that we saw in auto and steel and all of these industries was, you know, largely based on companies not waging the kind of war against workers that we see now. I mean, obviously they had done that before, and then the Wagner Act was passed as a compromise to prevent, all of this unrest and potential, greater worker militancy from happening. Um, but with the 70s and neoliberalism and, companies having greater power to move factories or offshore factories, they started, waging these anti-union crusades against workers in the US, deunionizing. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think people who used to take unions for granted and appreciate, the benefit that unions could provide became ideologically, opposed to any kind of workplace democracy or worker power. And so, I don't think that we should be using the Make America Great Again slogan, but I do think that if we want people to actually have quality of life and have, the ability to survive, we have to have much greater union density. And that's, people are always talking about how do we save democracy, especially right now. But the least democratic place in the US society has been the non-union workplace, where companies just have total say over, people's conditions, whether people have a job, whether people have health care that is tied to their job, all of these things. And so if people are so used to not having democracy in the workplace, they're more likely to accept authoritarianism outside the workplace. And so if we actually want to rebuild democracy, we have to rebuild the labor movement.
Yes, that's so important to get attention to that. Basically, as the country is facing autocracy, and it wouldn't happen if we had uh, employees who had power and could offset some of these awful things happening. But let me shift to another issue, um, and that is right now, some Starbucks are unionized and most of them aren't. Can one show that in the unionized Starbucks, they're more profitable, the workers are happier, the happiness is flowing right into the customers, and that's not happening in the non-unionized ones? Do you have any data with that comparison that having won unions in some of the Starbucks, they are performing better?
Well, it's a little bit complicated because the company is still fighting the union and still hasn't,
So the
agreed to a
workers are
first
still on
contract.
edge too about. I bet some of the ones who have unionized are wondering how long will this last? That we're still fighting, even though we have a union.
Well,
And
no,
then,
exactly. I mean, the company has fired workers, has closed stores, and has given non-union stores a lot of the benefits that we asked for at the bargaining table and then said, oh, well, we can't give these benefits to you until you get a contract. Um, I mean,
okay.
that's actually resulted in Starbucks workers across the country getting things like seniority pay. Starbucks had never given workers compensation
I
for,
was leaning
their
towards
years
some
of
goods,
service.
but yeah.
Um,
So,
we won credit card tipping
yeah.
for all the non-union workers, which the company has now started to grant to the unionized stores when they came back to the bargaining table and said that they wanted to change their approach. Um, so certainly, in terms of the financials, Starbucks workers across the entire company have gotten increases and benefits based on the union campaign. But the company has still is still cutting hours at unionized stores and still, retaliating against workers in a way that, a company that was actually recognizing the right to organize wouldn't. So in terms of the data, I think it's still, that'll be easier to measure once we have a first contract.
have you been able to find very good law firms that are able to document that the laws about union organizing are being violated by Starbucks?
Yeah, I mean, we've had fantastic legal support on this campaign, and Starbucks, I think, has already set a new record for the most individual violations of labor law of any modern
That should
company.
be a headline in the New York Times, about how bad they have been about violence.
There has been some really great coverage, thanks to some of the labor journalists, Noam Scheiber and other folks. There's an article called How a Union Loses Starbucks Dirty War Against Workers or something like that. That was fantastic. Um, but I think the real lesson that I've gotten from the Starbucks campaign is, the company can have NLRB decision after decision saying, you broke the law, this is bad. But the law is actually incentivizing workers, or sorry, the law incentivizes companies to break the law first and ask questions later because there aren't penalties. The remedies are very minimal, reinstate this worker that you fired, give them some back pay, maybe reopen a closed store, maybe give people some, of the back credit card tips or back seniority pay you didn't give them. But in the meantime, you've managed to scare thousands of workers across the company, that if they unionize, their lives will get materially worse. And so, I think the
Mhm.
real leverage for a company isn't the law, but is customer support, where, a boycott is much more impactful to a company's margins than an NLRB case.
I believe that playing to the media should have a strategy. There should be strategic thinking about what impressions could be created favoring unionization and the workers by dramatic headlined events. Is there someone thinking about that in the union movement against Starbucks?
For sure. And I mean, I get into this some in my book, about the different camps within the union, in terms of strategy. The folks making the decisions at this point are more the top union leadership versus in the beginning, it was a very grassroots, very worker-led campaign. But as a result, our media and our social media was, very relatable and, very much by the workers and authentic in a way that, a Berlin Rosen press release from one of the top, consulting firms that helps, do union comms is not as relatable and not as genuine. So I think, certainly we spend a lot of time building relationships with journalists and cultivating social media presence. Um, Casey Moore, one of my coworkers, led our TikTok campaign when I'd never even been on TikTok before. Um, but she was getting millions of views on videos about, Starbucks union busting, about workers walking out after people like Sam Amato, a 14-year Starbucks worker, were fired in retaliation for organizing. And so that was really, really critical to getting the word out. And that's a big piece of what we're trying to teach folks at the Inside Organizer School now is, how do you replicate that? Because, the Starbucks campaign is kind of a little bit out of our hands, but we're trying to replicate that in lots of other campaigns and with multiple unions to try to build that formula out into something that, if we could do it, anybody can do it.
Do you, would there be a chance of getting some of the program 60 Minutes to do a big show on this campaign
We
uh,
pitched
about the
them
union movement?
We pitched them before. They ended up not doing it, but there's been some really great coverage from, a lot of different papers and some of the bigger TV news shows too.
Okay. Here's the thing that I would think it would be important to think about. What's going to happen in the next few months and what the union should be prepared to do about it. As soon as Trump goes back to his tariffs, uh, and he said he claims he's getting exactly the tariffs he wants from different companies. Uh, those tariffs, like 20% to Vietnam and this and that, and China, it's maybe a huge tariff. It's going to raise our prices. And also, there's this whole movement to show how much of the cost of products is due to the tariff. There's a big fight about that because Trump doesn't want any mention of the percentage of the cost increase that is due to the tariffing.
Hmm.
But I think it's going to be reported. So in the next month, two or three, costs will be hitting people very hard. Let's assume that things are going to get worse. Does that make it easier to unionize or harder? And some thought should be given to that question because I know times are going to get worse for everyone.
Um, One of the most important things that we need to be doing is, obviously, I think organizing, there's not a perfect formula for it. And sometimes people, bad times make people more anxious about losing their jobs, or, um, if it's a tough labor market, then that can be, more threatening to people to take on the risk of unionizing and potentially facing that retaliation. But I also think that people can also reach a breaking point where, maybe you can't take the risk or you can't afford to, go on strike or lose your job, but you also can't afford to keep doing things the way that you've been doing them. And I think especially now, a lot of young folks are seeing the labor movement not just as, their means of securing, livable wages and, being able to pay rent or have health care, but also as a political force for good, whether it's pushing back against corporate pinkwashing around LGBTQ issues by saying, you can't have queer liberation without labor rights and economic justice, whether it's saying you can't have racial justice, or, any other kind of social justice without actually having a commitment to, you know, respecting workers' right to organize, et cetera. And so I think as the US is getting increasingly authoritarian and we're seeing, immigrants' rights being stripped away, the entire idea of due process being thrown to the wayside in service of, you know, Trump's ideas of, ethnic cleansing, et cetera. Um, People are going to see the labor movement as a force that can take this on. The one caveat I would say is that some labor unions have been sort of playing footsie with Trump's tariff policies and other policies, whether it's the Teamsters, really endorse, I mean, like Sean O'Brien speaking at the Republican convention, or whether it's the UAW, co-signing onto the tariff policy in part and like trying to walk this weird line, um, that ends up still giving credence to what Trump is doing. And so all of that to say, I think it's incredibly important that labor unions hold the line and, don't try to make compromises with a authoritarian or fascist regime, and actually, present organizing a union as the best way to fight back against this, not try to get, some concessions from a regime that's trying to stamp us out and that, has already been kidnapping union organizers who happen to be immigrants, or like in the case of David Huerta, the California SEIU president, who is, trying to um, stand in between members who are getting grabbed by ICE.
Unemployment will become a growing major issue in the next few weeks. The students, the college graduates can't get jobs. Um, so holding on to jobs is going to be much more important than signing up to unionize. So the odds are against strong efforts to succeed to unionize more people.
You're not going to be able to get workers to organize unless there's enough of an understanding among people that,
Yeah.
as risky as it could be to organize, the risks of not doing so are even greater. And, without a union, everybody's at will, meaning at the will of the boss, and they can be fired at any time. And with a union, there are protections. And, of course, technically it is illegal to fire people for unionizing. But again, the law is less of an accountability mechanism than the public. Um, but I think people who are deciding to organize now are also trying to build a movement in society that is capable of taking on, you know, all of these combined forces of oppression, whether it's, the state plus companies, whether it's Palantir or, the other contractors that are responsible for enabling a lot of the surveillance and oppression that's happening, or the bosses at these individual companies. Um, People, I think, understand that, general strikes and other kinds of work stoppages have been critical to stopping fascism in the past. And, in Italy in the 40s, general strikes weren't necessarily immediately successful and were met with a lot of repression, but that was really key to toppling Mussolini's dictatorship and establishing that people didn't go along with that. And so I think, we are in a tricky moment, but also people want to fight back, are kind of looking for tangible things to do because the whole point of um, all of these onslaughts and attacks and outrages happening at once is to make people feel totally overwhelmed by how bad everything is all around us all at once. And so organizing your workplace, has risks, but is the most tangible thing that you can do to build the power to actually fight back against the system.
W- You're saying it's not implausible, really, to show up in bad times with in an attempt to re-brainwash people for why unions will help them.
I
Is
try to
anything
pitch
being planned,
I
or is
try
it
to push back a little bit on it being brainwashing. I think our goal is more to try to pull out
you don't
things
like
that
to say
are
you're a brainwasher, but the truth is there's two sides, and both sides are trying to brainwash.
I don't know about brainwashing. I mean, again, I think if people don't want to unionize, nothing that we can
Yeah.
do, especially with a playing field very much stacked against us, is going to convince people to do something. But I do think that I think organizing and standing up is latent within a lot of people, and so, encouraging people that they have it within them.
Okay, so
But
let me say that let's use some marketing thinking here. First, identify those customer groups that are pro-union or easily who would have pro-union persuasion, because you got to work with those segments that, and by the way, the if you just look at the companies that appear on the screen, there's so many good companies, progressive companies, that will help you know where the segments are. I mean, anyone who listens to these progressive programs are in groups that would favor union strength, and try to get them to mention Starbucks issues and so on more often. Um, because you don't want to, it doesn't pay to try to hit the MAGA people.
Well, I think the folks who are participating in the No Kings rallies and the folks who would be doing a general strike are slightly different groups. I will say during the 2019, or I think, yeah, during the 2019 government shutdown, the reason that, the Trump administration and congressional Republicans did cave and did break through the shutdown was when Sarah Nelson from the Flight Attendants Union called for a general strike in response to the shutdown. And that scared the companies and scared the government into actually stopping what they were doing. And so I think they know that, this threat is there. Oh, I don't know why that's doing that. I think they know that this threat is there and, is alarming to them. We have to make it more of a reality and more of a threat. Okay. So back to Phil's point about converting MAGA folks. I think oftentimes we think about organizing as preaching to the choir and, getting the folks who are at the No Kings rallies to do something. And, choirs are good places to start sometimes, but I actually think in some ways the folks who are the mo would be the most receptive to an economic overhaul are actually people who are also interested in right-wing populism. And the reason for that is that people who are happy with the Democratic Party establishment, who think that, Nancy Pelosi is great, we have no complaints with Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, these people are probably also, pretty keen on Howard Schultz, pretty keen on the companies that they think are doing great. Um, Right-wing populism taps into working class anger and it tries to channel it down into punching down against those who are more vulnerable and more at risk. And of course, that is a ruling class strategy. So, instead of people being mad at Elon Musk or, mad at their boss, they can be mad at the immigrants. They can be mad at the trans people. They can be mad at anybody who is a convenient scapegoat for their problems. But that working class rage is still there. And so, what I've seen, whether it was working on the Nissan campaign in Mississippi and trying to organize white workers at Nissan to stop thinking that, joining with their black coworkers was the problem and to start understanding that this whole system that was, trying to pit them against each other was actually the cause of their oppression, um, is the way to actually move people along. And so I think union organizing is a really powerful way to move people from punching down into punching up and actually understanding who's really responsible for their oppression, unlearning a lot of the bigotry that they've been told, is responsible for their problems and actually becoming, in solidarity with their coworkers and with the people they've been taught, are the enemy. And so I think that's really the only way that we're going to fundamentally transform society is, giving folks who have gotten that conditioning their whole lives, a way to actually experience solidarity and community. And there's all kinds of studies that show that, white working class folks who are in unions are much less likely to actually act on their authoritarian tendencies than folks who aren't in unions because, learning this solidarity and learning about, their shared interest and shared struggle does change the way people vote and think about society, and changes the way that people want to experience democracy. In the case of Starbucks, someone like Michelle Eisen, who was planning to quit in August of 2021, when we had our first conversation about unionizing, she told me she had one foot out the door. She'd been at Starbucks for 12 years. She was just waiting for her stocks to vest in November, and then she was gone. But she also told me that she was really pro-union. She was a stage manager. She'd, been in unionized environments. She'd seen what worked and what didn't work, often within unionized environments. Um, and her family was from Harlan County, Kentucky, and had been involved in, organizing miners in the past. And so she understood intuitively, that a union was a good thing and that it would be beneficial for Starbucks. She ended up staying at Starbucks for 4 more years to help lead the union campaign, stay with the bargaining. And so I think that's incredibly heroic, and that's the kind of leadership that, really can transform what a company looks like. Even if everything was done today, Starbucks Workers United, even without a contract, has still transformed, you know, a lot of what people think about the service industry, a lot of what other people, whether you're at REI or Trader Joe's or Chipotle or Amazon, think about whether it's possible to take on a mega company and when. Um, but I think, whether it's union organizing or, I think like the Mamdani campaign is showing, people who are voting for Zoran often had voted for Trump before. And so there is this swing back of, if you give people something to vote for, and if you talk about, working class issues and channel that anger upward instead of downward, instead of just denying that that anger is valid and saying, oh, the economy is fine, actually, we're doing great, um, then people will come back and will also, support people who are trying to make positive changes. My book, Get on the Job and Organize, is intended to help demystify the process of union organizing so that, people understand how to start organizing their workplaces, how to navigate some of the challenges that companies will try to throw up in your way, and also to talk about the practice of salting, which means getting a job with the goal of organizing it, which is a really amazing tactic. It was critical to building the labor movement, from the foundations, um, whether you were, in a giant factory or in agriculture, like salting has been one of the bedrock tactics. But it's not something that we talk about a lot, mostly because, we don't want to tip the boss off, that we might be trying to get folks hired in. But the result of that has been that the bosses know about it because they have anti-union consultants telling them about it, and folks who might actually want to organize their own workplaces or who are interested in getting involved in the labor movement have no idea where to start. So the book is designed to help people understand, the multiple paths into organizing and, help them get started.
Well, how's your book doing, or what's being done to get many more people to know about the book?
Well, some of the unions that I'm working with are helping put together events. But yeah, I mean, I think it has to get out of the usual suspects crowd. So
Mm.
um, I'm hoping that, this talk and lots of other talks that I'm doing will help more folks hear about it and hopefully spread the word themselves.
Well, if someone came along and said, why don't you make 1,000 of your copies free to people? Would you know who it would be good to send them to?
I mean, I think like the hope is to get it into the hands of lots of workers who are interested in organizing.
I see.
But we do a school called the Inside Organizer School. We're using it as a manual for folks who are coming through that program.
Okay.
And yeah, I think trying to get it to more folks who might be able to take on
Do,
organizing in their own
do you think
workplace.
the Democratic superstructure, those who are high in the Democratic movement, know about your book? I mean, should a copy go to some of the well-known leaders to remind them of this issue?
Well, Bernie Sanders wrote a blurb for the book, which was
Oh,
very
good.
kind. So Bernie knows about it. But
And Obama knows about it, doesn't he?
I don't know.
Because the whole,
You're on mute.
yeah, there's a popular, what the look, first of all, it's a Democratic issue more than a Republican issue about unions. And the Democrats who are running the show are really to be replaced. They are, they were asleep or ineffective. Uh, I'm so happy about this guy, Mamdani, in New York.
Yes.
That's the type that's he's really an Obama coming back to life, or some. We're all looking for new leadership, and we hope that as we spot new leaders, and they're found in different places, like the guy who in Kentucky, the governor, he's terrific. Uh, Bishar, I guess is his name. Some of them should get to know about this issue too and talk about that issue and how employment is going to rest on people having power as employees. So, anyways, you're so impressive. The movement is going to depend on you and your friends and people like that. Um, you have a wonderful way to put things, and I wish you could create more jazzes behind the movement.
Well, I think every organizing campaign creates a lot of really cool people who didn't know that they could take on that leadership. So I think we are doing a lot of replicating. But it's so great to meet you, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And I've heard really great things about you, so really
Well,
cool
if
to
we,
meet you.
thank you. If we have any new thoughts on misleadership, and other and on regenerative leadership, we'll talk to you again, okay?